Hello and welcome to After the Gig. Thank you all of you who made it here, who are joining us from YouTube across many countries and time zones. As I understand it, we have people here from Indonesia, Brazil, Spain, Nigeria. I can keep listing them off. It's my pleasure to acknowledge this is a bi-coastal event between the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles and the Platform Cooperative Program at the New School in New York City. My name is Yakov Feygin. I'm the director of the Future Capitalism program at the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles. The Berggruen Institute is an idea incubator, engaging with the great transformations of our time. It means so much to me to welcome a scholar who means much to my own intellectual life and development, starting actually from her early work on the golden age of capitalism and into her work on such well-titled books, I would say, as The Overworked American, The Overspent American, and then Plentitudes, and now her latest work, which we will be discussing after the gig. Professor Schor is a national authority on issues of work, economic inequality, the climate catastrophe, and so many other things. After 17 years as a Harvard professor, she is now at Boston College. Before I start, I would like to do a little bit of administrative housekeeping. I would like to remind everyone in the audience that they are welcome to ask questions on the YouTube platform or on Slido using the code #AfterTheGig. Details are in the YouTube description box. And now I get the privilege of handing it over to Trebor. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, my name is Trebor Scholz. I'm a professor activist at the New School in New York City, where I also run the Platform Cooperativism Consortium. And yeah, it's such a pleasure to welcome Juliet Schor. It's really wonderful, and thank you to everybody who has joined. So many people wrote us from all over the world that they want to join this forum and learn about Juliet Schor's new book. So amazing, welcome to all of you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. And yeah, I'm a fellow at the Berggruen Institute here in Los Angeles this year. And reading Juliet Schor's book, I thought, I talked to Yakov and said, wow, we should really invite Juliet. And this is just such a wonderful conversation and sounds just amazing. And yeah, so we would love to discuss her finding with her. She's really, as Yakov said, certainly a national leader when it comes to issues of work, inequality, feminism as well, right? And the climate catastrophe. And yeah, so I just maybe would love to discuss the book with her. And of course, Juliet is also not a stranger, right? So she has been a long-term supporter of our work on platform cooperativism. And she spoke at most of our conferences. And, you know, I dare call her a friend. I don't know, hope I can do that. So welcome, Juliet. And we appreciate that you took the time for this conversation away from teaching and all your other obligations. So good morning.
Oh, good morning. No, it's a great pleasure to be here and really looking forward to our conversation. Thanks to you all, both for organizing.
Okay, I think Yakov wants to start it off with the question.
I thought we maybe Juliet could give us.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is right. So we should do a little bit of housekeeping here too, right? So we want to have first a short introduction by Juliet Schor, where she introduces the book and some of the key ideas. Then I think Yakov and I will both ask questions, and then we will draw on some of the questions from that you can post on Slido. So apologies.
Great. Thanks, Trebor. So I got interested in this topic actually when I was writing my Plenitude book, and that was during the financial crash, 2008 and 9. Because I was thinking about, you know, what is the way forward and what kind of economic and social innovations can happen that will help us to meet the challenges of extreme inequality, climate catastrophe, and so on. And I was intrigued by these new peer-to-peer markets enabled by digital technology that were beginning to be founded in 2008, 2009, as well as some of the sort of less technologically advanced innovations that were happening. These were kind of they were identifying themselves as a viable alternative to global corporations and all of the problematic human and ecological impacts of those corporations. So if we think about particularly the transactions platforms, and we can talk more about what that means, the technology that they use offers a way to solve long-standing problems of informal markets and of what I've called stranger sharing. And in particular, these are issues around the costs of search and the risks associated with transacting with unknown others. And these problems have long plagued resale markets for goods and informal markets for personal services. And those are two of the big areas where we've seen these new peer-to-peer markets emerge. So with a team of what eventually grew to be 8 PhD students, we began studying these new forms, and we started with community-based nonprofit sharing initiatives like a time bank, a food swap, a maker space. And then as the for-profit platforms were scaling so rapidly, growing really rapidly, we turned our attention to them looking at TaskRabbit, which is an errands platform, Airbnb, delivery apps, ride-hail apps, Airbnb for cars, etc. Now, in the early days, the profits and the nonprofits formed a kind of common community with what I've called an idealist discourse of common good. They claimed they were going to have great economic impacts, wonderful social benefits, that they would create deep social ties and people would make friends on them, and that they were going to solve the climate crisis. Of course, we know things turned out rather differently. And in the subtitle, I call what happened to hijack, how the sharing economy got hijacked and how to win it back. Because I want to stress that there is a potential there that attracted me and many others to these platforms 10 years ago. And I think that potential is still there with different social relations. So we did, from 2011 to 2017, funded by the MacArthur Foundation, we did case studies, 13 case studies in the original project, hundreds of interviews. We did ethnography, where we went to sites and spent time there, and we did big data analysis on Airbnb. And our final case, which Trebor knows a lot about, was Stocksy, which was sort of at the time the largest, most successful platform cooperative, at least in North America. And we looked at a variety of issues. I mean, one is, how should we understand these new forms? And here I'm thinking about the for-profits. Is what really is novel the technology, as some people focus on? Or are they just a continuation of ongoing trends toward creating more precarity, shifting risk onto workers, a long-standing trend that had been going on in the corporate economy with outsourcing and fishering and so forth? And we found that a key factor, which most of the research had ignored, but which is really crucial to understanding how the platforms operate, which is that they operate with highly heterogeneous workforces. And this makes them very different within doing the same job. This makes them different than conventional firms. And it also yields very heterogeneous worker experiences. And we found that the experience of people who were dependent on the platform to pay their basic expenses was very different from those who used them casually for extra income. And I think that's part of why some of the political debates in the United States, for example, the debates over AB 5 and Proposition 22 in California, have been so confusing for voters. We also spent quite a bit of time studying how the platforms affect social inequalities, in particular, racial inequality. We looked at racism on the platforms, as well as class inequality. And the big picture there is that it partly depends on the platform, but the claim, which many made for these platforms in the early days, that they were going to be able to reduce class inequality and solve problems of racism, is not borne out by our research at all. And these pernicious isms got imported onto the platforms in, complicated and unfortunate ways. Our final case, Stocksy, is again, we found very interesting, a very successful platform in many ways, but characterized by the same kind of heterogeneity we found on the other apps, on Airbnb or TaskRabbit. The differences between casual and dependent earners, between, I should have said Stocksy as a photographers cooperative, between hobbyist photographers and highly commercially oriented artists. And it is a kind of winner-take-all market, which many platforms have that tendency. There's research on platforms like Etsy or Upwork to show that winner-take-all feature, and we can talk more about that. Of course, it's less true on services which are less differentiated, like ride hail, for example. And there's a lot more to say about that. After the book was written, I began work on a new project funded by NSF with colleagues at Northeastern, looking specifically at labor issues. We've been studying Instacart, delivery workers, ride hail, and also caring labor. This is all post-pandemic, and I'm happy to talk about that. And I'll just end with the point that I remain optimistic about platforms. I think the first phase has been a disaster in many ways, but I think they do still have potential to create to be part of a different kind of economy. If we can mobilize people, capital, and energy to transform the way they're currently operating. So let me stop there, and I look forward to our conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Schor. I'd like to start with a question. Can you describe what makes a company specifically a platform? It feels very intuitive, but I think we might need to have like some kind of more formal definition. And can you also elaborate a bit on this term you use in the book, which I thought was really apt, called the platform hierarchy, and how it amplifies certain inequalities and the kind of assets the platform is trying to monetize?
Yes. It's a great place to start because the term platform is used very, very widely, and actually in my book and my work, as well as much of the literature about these particular platforms, they are a subset of platforms. So what my work has focused on is actually platforms in what is, problematically has been called the sharing economy space. So these are digital transactions platforms. They are peer-to-peer platforms, also called by economists multi-sided platforms. So they are between the customers and the providers, or the workers and the customers. There are lots of other kinds of platforms too. Google is a platform, or Facebook is a platform, and we're not talking about those. And another important thing is that many companies have created internal platforms that they use in the context of, a more conventionally oriented. Now, of course, what some people would argue is that these platforms are just intermediaries, and I was about to say that and stop myself because, of course, for many of them, and Uber's the perfect example here, they've actually come to operate much more like a conventional company in a lot of ways, at hiring workers, controlling them, et cetera. And that's at the core of many of the debates about misclassification and how do we understand working for a platform. But digital platforms, typically peer-to-peer, they use certain features. So they almost all use matching algorithms or search algorithms of one kind or another, and they use crowdsourced ratings and reputational data. So those tend to be the main features. And almost all of them hire the providers as independent contractors rather than employees, although I can tell you a little bit about some new research we've done on a company that switched to employee status, which is really interesting.
And so one of the things that I found most fascinating in this kind of hierarchy you describe is that the hierarchy replicates many things we see outside the platform economy. Kind of, as an example, the highest return platform to its users is Airbnb, right? Because it's monetizing real estate. Afterwards, you have something like the car sharing platform, right? Turo, right? That's the car one. And then at the bottom, you kind of have TaskRabbit, and then you have Uber, which are labor monetizing platforms. So the question I have really around that is, within this hierarchy, right? Can we address these all as one economy and have one set of strategies to study them? Or do we have to kind of study them as aspects of a larger problem of inequality on return of assets and return of power on labor versus asset ownership?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm sorry you had asked that about the hierarchy and I forgot to answer it in the first answer. So I think the first point that you made is a really important one. And it's that we have to think about the relationship between what has been called the platform sector or the platform economy and the larger economy. And this is one of the things that didn't happen in the early days of the literature. There was so much hype about this thing that it's so new and so different. It's just its own thing. And so people had a tendency to analyze it as if it were somehow totally distinct from the larger labor market and the larger economy. And that led them into sort of, various errors of thinking, I think, because the structure of the conventional economy actually, is replicated in many ways, as you say, and we found that hierarchy across many dimensions. And exactly as you say, the platforms that involve more capital tend to yield higher returns to the earners. And as you go down the hierarchy, the amount of labor versus capital tends to increase, and the skills, the extent to which the skills are general in the population also tends to increase. So being able to drive, for example, which is a widely shared skill, doesn't yield a lot of return because so many people can do it. TaskRabbit was an interesting in-between platform. Almost everyone on TaskRabbit had a college degree, and there were quite a few people with skills above the sort of, most basic, highly generalized skills. And those wages were much higher than wages for Uber driving, for example, or food delivery. Interestingly, even when the service was something like driving or cleaning, another fairly widely shared skill. So part of why we were able to discover this was that we did a multi-platform study. Most of the research people looked at one platform, and so didn't necessarily see that whole range. So yes, a key thing is to kind of think about the platform in the context of the larger labor market and what's happening in that larger labor market, because it always has impacts on the platform. And we can get more into that.
This is a great segue into another question, if you don't mind me jumping in, Trebor, because I think it's perfect. At least in the United States, and I think especially in Western Europe, is this economy, the gig economy that's developed, is this really a post-2008 phenomenon? What I mean by that is, even before 2008, the labor market, especially the United States, was not a very tight labor market, really since 2000. But after 2008, the recovery has been, particularly anemic until about 2018, and then we had COVID, right? And also you had extremely low yields, very little state investment. So you had a lot of capital looking for quick returns, right? Which could fund these platforms, right? Out of the venture capital pool. If we're, as many people are arguing, and I think they're correct, entering a kind of new economic regime with much more government spending, with tighter labor markets, with maybe a return to a bit of inflation, can these companies survive? Will this ecosystem look the same at the other side of COVID? Or is this going to be a major regime change for them too?
Yeah, it's a great
Maybe
question.
Could I tag on to this like I did in our preparation? I think another aspect of this is also the recent labor wins, right, that we saw in the UK and in other places as well, where labor has managed to establish, minimum wage also in New York City, right, where labor has managed to establish minimum wages for drivers, Uber drivers in particular. And the question is, a company that is already bleeding some, $5 billion, $8 billion a year, and not really making profits in this particular taxi business, like is this even sustainable?
Yeah. Okay, so lots to say about both of those questions. I think the first point I would make is certainly the condition of the economy was important in establishing these companies in the early days. For example, we found a lot of the people who started working on them were college students who couldn't find jobs because of the collapse and the Great Recession. This was important because it served to help destigmatize this kind of work. And if you think historically, driving, cleaning, these kinds of delivery work, personal services, are not typically done by college students, highly educated. Also, it was a very white labor force to begin with. But the combination of the recession and also the kind of marketing that the firms did, which was, oh, this is hip, it's cool, it's novel, it destigmatized it, and so you got that highly educated, largely white labor force in the early days. So the first point is, in relation to your question, the larger labor market trends will affect who's available and willing to work on these platforms. That said, you've had a real erosion of steady, full-time, good W-2, as it's called in the United States, employment. So, and there's a big overhang of people who need work. Plus, the destigmatization of the platforms means that people who already have jobs also go on these. I saw a fascinating article today about a district attorney in Long Island. He's called the DoorDash district attorney. He started doing DoorDash on the side. I mean, that's a reasonably paid, stable job to be a district attorney. And he actually started doing it during work hours and got caught and, has since out of his job and so forth. But many of the people that we've interviewed and others have interviewed are people who have full-time jobs, who are doing this on top of it. And I think that labor force won't diminish unless we start to see a lot of change in the levels of inequality in the country. And that's partly because of the stagnation of middle-class incomes and the extreme concentration of income at the top. So I don't think the labor force is going to disappear for these platforms. And a lot of people like working on them, not, more on some than others. And we can talk more about that. But that said, the platforms will be facing much more upward pressure in terms of wages. And I think the last thing I want to say on this before I get to Trebor's question about the organizing and the labor union, labor wins and so forth, is even aside from what's happening in the macro economy and how hot or cold the economy is, a number of these platforms are not profitable at their current in their current markets. And ride hail, of course, is the most obvious. They lowered the price to expand the market to a point that they cannot make money. And they're doing the same thing in delivery. So it's always been the case that if there is pressure from investors or stock owners after they've gone public to make profits, they're going to have to raise the prices, and that means they're going to have to contract. The markets are going to contract because these are services. Taking a taxi versus walking, not going somewhere, biking, public transportation that's a pretty elastic demand, meaning it changes with the price. And when when they price it at the same as public transportation, there's a lot of people who want to take an Uber. But when they price it where taxis used to be, which is, they're going to have to get somewhere close to that, there's not a lot. That's why it was so important to the ride-hail companies to destroy public transportation, because they really felt, and Uber said that in its initial IPO filings, they really felt that they needed that to dominate the market. To Trebor's point about the wins from the labor unions, yes, and it's a similar point to the question of what happens in a hot economy. So we're seeing more pressure from below to raise wages, to improve working conditions, and so forth. And if this sort of hotter economy prevails, we're going to see more and more of that. One of the first papers, probably the first paper I ever published as I was a grad, just doing it during my graduate work in economics, was on strikes and what determines strikes. And what I found with my advisor, Sam Bowles, was when the cost of what we call the cost of job loss to workers went down, that is, how if they lose the job they have, what else can they get, and how much of a difference in wages and working conditions and so forth is their next best alternative. And when that cost of job loss goes down, people are much more likely to strike. And that's what's happening now. And that's what a hot economy does. It drastically reduces the cost of job loss for workers. So you see lots of sort of pro-worker dynamics in the economy.
But I guess my question was, if that is the case, how is that model even sustainable if you think of Uber speculation to dominate the global market with all this investor funding, and then perhaps switch to autonomous cars, which now doesn't seem to be in the cards very much, right? With the shutdown of their own autonomous car, lab, but also technologically doesn't really seem to be in the near future. So, sort of, what does this all add up to in terms of the future for that company and others?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that these companies can be profitable. So Airbnb is profitable. Etsy is profitable. The companies that take a reasonable fee from a transaction can be profitable, because people will stay, they are actually providing a service. People will stay on the platform. So whether we're talking about labor platforms or goods resale platforms or, rental platforms, those can all work. And, the ride-hail platforms can too, and the food delivery platforms can too. But there are going to be two things that have to be different about them to work. One is that the markets are going to shrink, because right now the size of the markets the sizes are inflated because the prices are artificially low, predatory, we could say, in the ride-hail case. So fewer people are going to pay to get their food delivered at a higher price. So that's, the markets will shrink, the prices will go up, but you can be profitable there. I don't know that Uber's going to make it, because, who knows? They understand this as well as I do, I'm sure. I think you're right. Autonomous cars are not going to be here anytime soon. They've pushed their drivers, squeeze them about as much as they can. They're going to be forced to raise driver pay over time, and some of the consumers will adjust. So there's still going to be a market there. That's my view.
So, okay, I will jump in with my question, which, is really, I'm just thinking about the people who are, following this online. Many of them practitioners, actual gig workers all over the world, right? In many different countries, not just in the United States, where Uber is really often also a full-time occupation. And I'm just curious what you, in your book, you talk about the work on the commons-based peer production, and so how, and perhaps the success of that. But I wonder, when you see Wikipedia, succeeding, but I think when we see an open source production has been, absorbed to a good extent by corporations. I think the vision that we've seen of peer production really taking over as a sector or really becoming significant has perhaps not come true. And that, I think, is linked to the question, because sharing is so central, I guess, to your vision, right? Also already in Plentitude but really, I think, strongly here, right? I think this seems to be really your vision, is just, like a better sharing, right? Like let's do this sort of sharing economy thing just genuinely, right? But how exactly do you imagine this? Spoken to these practitioners that are watching, how would you suggest to them? Maybe this isn't the purview of your book, and I apologize if that sort of steps beyond the boundaries, but maybe you have some thoughts on this. So the question is really about your vision, and at the core of the book, what do you want people to sort of walk away with, right? Having studied all this, the analysis that you put in, the conversations you had, what do you take away for people who are in that economy and try to make better lives right now?
Yeah, it's a great question, and such an important one, particularly at a moment when, there is much more possibility around the world today to talk about transforming our economies and what kind of economies should we be trying to evolve into. So what is the vision? And I think the first thing I would say is the vision is pluralistic. So it's very much in contrast to the tradition that I was raised in, which, I would refer to as the one best way tradition. So the debates about capitalism versus socialism, for example, what is the one best way, or debates about the nature of the structure of the firm and so forth. And so, my discipline is originally economics, and so much of what economics tries to figure out is the optimal model, whether it's for a firm or a society, a market, etc. So we have a lot of uncertainty in our world. We have a lot of turbulence ahead because of what's happening with ecological overshoot. And I think we need to be open to the fact that we're going to have a hybrid, pluralistic economy. We're going to have to do a lot of experimentation, et cetera. So what does that mean concretely about the questions you asked? So I think a view that says, peer production is it. The whole economy should go to peer production, or the platform co-op is it. Every enterprise should be a platform co-op, or the commons economy is it. That should be. So I would urge us to get out of that kind of thinking and to understand that really what will probably work best is a combination of all those things. All of the economic sort of structures that we build and try and create should be based on some, general principles around fairness and democratic governance and so forth. But in different contexts, we're going to want different things. And so for ecosystems, we know some of those commons-based management that Eleanor Ostrom studied, or the digital versions of those commons, works well. For certain kinds of production where you have much more easily measurable outputs, and you don't have as much of a commons, worker co-ops are a really great model. In other contexts, we're going to want those voluntary contribution kinds of gift economies and loaning economies and so forth, markets. So I see sort of us iterating towards a mix of all of these different forms that is kind of a mix that really works, and that is probably not static over time. Small businesses, I think, will be an important part of it. There are people who just like to kind of control their own fate, and they don't necessarily want to be involved in collaborative production. So I think that for those of us in this larger community of people who are working on economic alternatives, we should avoid trying to say our way is better and what you're doing is terrible and here's why everyone should follow me. And let's see which kinds of arrangements actually end up working and growing and thriving, because they are the right mix for that situation. So maybe you think that's a cop-out answer, I don't know. But I actually, it's what I really believe.
No, I mean, it's at the heart of what I believe as well, right? Like an organizational bricolage, as Jukka Benkler would say, or like an, entrepreneurial pluralism, for sure, right? No question. Definitely. The question is just there's such a power asymmetry, right? Where you have these 5 companies, and the complete domination of the modern corporation as an organizational form, right? So like to make this shift, right, is to this sort of more diversified ecosystem, exactly how to get there, right? That's, I guess, the question.
Absolutely. And, notice what I said, we have these entities need to be founded on certain principles of fairness and democratic governance. That excludes the modern corporation. So we do need to fight them, and we need to fight them on 2 fronts. One is in creating the alternatives, the kind of work that, you are so centrally involved in, as well as fighting them, through the state to try and control and shrink and demand that they either change radically or die. I mean, there just is, they are really toxic, pernicious entities, many of them. And they, we've got to get rid of them.
That really leads to a question I just was thinking about, right? Is what is the role not only of unions and society as a countervailing force, right? But what can the state do to be both a countervailing force and an enabling force for alternatives?
Yeah, and in the last chapter of the book, I talk about 2 big things. One is regulating the for-profit corporations in the platform sector that I'm in this, and the other is the platform cooperatives. And the regulation is key. The companies have been very successful in taking away the ability of cities to regulate them. In the United States, most of these entities are regulated at the city level. So where we're talking about hotels/accommodations and transportation. That's not the case in some other countries. In some other countries, you have had nationwide laws to regulate Uber and Lyft, or Lyft isn't in many countries, but Uber, for example. So this gets us back to the question of democratic control, because what's happened is that although at the city level you have a lot of democratic control and the people really can pressure the government to do things, at the state level it's much harder. And these companies, because the politicians are much more likely to be owned by these corporations, and so you have most states have passed laws. They're called preemption laws, which take away certain ability to regulate from the cities. And this is a peculiarity of the US constitutional system, in which the cities don't really have much of a role to play, and the states really have the right to override them. As I say, less true in lots of other places. But the state is key. The state is key to any major political transformation that is going to happen of any progressive kind, no matter where we are. So it will never happen just through sort of the evolution of market alternatives. I mean, there are people in our world writ large who think that just by creating these new alternatives, and if they're really great, they will grow and they will take over, and that's how you transform a system. And what I would say to that is I've called that sometimes the naive aggregationist model. It doesn't understand how systems change. So that innovation at the grassroots level is important, but it only changes systems when it gets powerful enough to begin to influence policy and to get the state involved to help make the transformation. So we're getting to that point where in many places where that innovation at the grassroots level, whether it's commons or peer production or platform co-ops or whatever, is alternative energy, et cetera, is enough of a force to try and push the state to then try and make the bigger change that is necessary.
Let me insert a provocation here, Juliet, because, you know, just from the people I talk to every day, right, in so many countries, they feel really deeply alienated from the government, right? And they find that the governments in Poland, in Hungary, in Brazil, and for the very most part also in this country, right? This moment, this very moment is maybe not very characteristic of this, but you know, just a few months ago and maybe a few months ahead, it will be quite similar, where people really don't feel at all that government is representing them, that they watch out for people. I mean, look in the United States, what happened over the last 50 years, right? I mean, how has the government, no matter who was in power, really systemically addressed economic inequality? So, I mean, I see these cooperatives emerging, platform co-ops in particular, really as a self-defense against government that doesn't care or doesn't, like, you know, even attacks them, right? So, I mean, I share your optimism about government in some, like in a broader sense, but in reality and looking at the actual countries and what this looks like, I understand that people think, well, this is really more like a safeguard, right? I mean, we are creating, and I agree with you completely that this cannot scale like, you know, like the 1930s agricultural cooperatives did with the New Deal, for example, right? Or rural electric cooperatives, that's absolutely true. But, you know, also sort of because you were so intense about emphasizing that it has to be government, right? I mean, what happens, and we see this reality all over the world, right? If you have completely dysfunctional government.
Yes, but the fact that people have lost faith in government doesn't mean that you don't need government to create the kind of society that they want. And what I would say is, so yes, I believe strongly in constructing these alternatives, but the idea that they can defend against a hostile or a fascist government, I think is also wrong. Because the government, you know, if you have that kind of an aggressive government in place, it will smash alternatives. And so those of us who are building alternatives need to understand that it's like you can't just create a utopia in your own house if everything that's going on outside of it is a disaster. You've got to get together with all the other people in their houses to try and change the larger environment. That's all I'm saying. It's not a, you know, I can't guarantee to you that we are going to win. All I can say is if we are going to win, we're going to need to have the state on our side.
It feels to me that the most important, at least from my point of view, enabling function that the state can take is for at least a kind of more cooperative economy is funding and financing, right? Because that's always the barrier. And the ability to, as a very good recent writer put it, the state to bear uncertainty versus the individual or even the private sector in funding those kind of things is just, that's the advantage and why we need the state, right? And I don't know, have either of you thought about ways that the state could jump over that financing barrier? That just comes to me.
Well, so yes, and they also set the rules of the game. Mm-hmm. So they can set the rules of the game in other ways. I think in some places, the ones that I know a little bit more about, and Trebor, you know, can jump in after I say this because he knows a lot more about this, where you have capital that has abandoned cities, number one, or cities with very progressive administrations, you do have the possibility, and we've already seen it, for cities to say, we're going to include cooperatives as part of what we are trying to support. So with financing, technical expertise, procurement and so forth. And I think that is at the moment where capital doesn't want to be is a place for cooperatives to be, or where capital is less welcome, as in the case of like the more progressive cities. Trebor, what do you think about that?
Well, just looking at history, right? So when you look at the history of cooperatives, they have always emerged in moments when the government, the state, the community, or in the global south, the family, was not able to sustain safety nets, right? So, I mean, this is the whole history of cooperatives back to the 1840s in the north of England, where people in the process of industrialization were essentially starving and protected themselves in this way, right? And were very successful in doing so. So the second point would be more of a plug, I guess, is the collaboration between the Platform Cooperativism Consortium and the Berggruen Institute. It's a white paper that is coming out in May, I would think, that where it's a collaboration with co-authored by several people that basically makes policy proposals for municipalities, how to advance platform cooperatives in their city. And that looks largely at procurement and the willingness and many other mechanisms, but the willingness is certainly there. I see this from city councils in San Francisco, in Melbourne, in Berlin, also on the federal level. So I think people are open to this, and so we will define those instruments hopefully very soon and make this useful to people in many countries, also in Kerala and in Sri Lanka and other places. It's a difficult discussion. Immediately my red lights go on when I say Kerala, because of course, there it is really the state that thinks of itself as implementing cooperatives, as the sort of painful history of the painful history of colonialism and cooperative, which intersects, right, where the British Empire has used cooperatives to really enforce their own rule, and in the case of South Africa, for example, to really bring European settlers into South African agriculture, right, by subsidizing cooperatives, which were predominantly really European settlers, white European settlers. And so a complicated discussion.
I think we can, we have a lot of questions coming in from our viewers. I think we can shift, because some of them are really great. So maybe we can start having a conversation based on them. I have a question from Slido here, where someone asks, what do you think about the role of worker cooperatives versus multi-stakeholder cooperatives, and how they can create mutually reinforcing networks of solidarity and social entrepreneurship? I think maybe even getting the differences between those and the different challenges that face both forms might be really useful. So I think this is definitely a question both you and Trebor. So yeah.
So I think there's a role for both. And, we don't have as many examples of the multi-stakeholder. I've always been interested, Trebor can tell me if I'm wrong here. I've always been interested in them. In part, there's always that tension or between the interests of the worker and the interests of the consumer, where you have the worker wanting a higher price, the consumer wanting a lower price at any given quality. And so a multi-stakeholder cooperative can sort of balance that in some ways. So I think there's a role for them. On the other hand, sort of analytically, it's sort of hard to say why or how, or, I think it's something that it really we can know more about in practice, how it works out. There's a kind of idealism there that may be, a little bit more difficult. With the worker cooperative, it's kind of clear, it's one set of interests. They go into the market, they do their thing. They're subjected to the demands from the consumers. If you bring the consumers on, you work it out at the board level? Does that really ensure that the market's there? So it's a lot more complicated.
Just two sentences on that, because it's so fascinating and rich. So there's, of course, a huge movement of multi-stakeholder cooperatives, which really goes against the, like some of these 19th century, and later criticisms, right? Like, Rosa Luxemburg in 1900 and others sort of arguing against this firewall of the cooperative, right? So what Juliet also referred to as, well, it only benefits the members, right? It's really not true, because, in Italy alone, there are, 11,000 social cooperatives, which is a part of multi-stakeholder cooperatives. And there's a really fascinating, very, very fascinating, deep in the mountains of the Italian Alps, you have these small villages that are run as community cooperatives, which is a relatively new form, where the cooperative takes on, due to the failure of the state, right, to intervene and help, takes on all functions in a town for everybody, not just the members, right? Like running the post office, running the restaurant, etc. So really fascinating and super interesting as a model for the internet when you think about data trusts or data cooperatives.
Yeah, so I should just be clear. I was talking about, digital cooperatives, one of the issues around them, of course, is that they're typically strangers. There are obviously platform co-ops that have started with people who know each other and locationally based and so forth, and they're doing a lot to create community among them. But the sort of archetypal platform form is an open access platform that anybody can join, and so that creates a whole other set of issues, and talking through those differences is really important. Are these platforms that restrict membership, co-ops that restrict membership, or is membership open to anybody? That's another, that's a decision point that a platform co-op has to make, and it's complicated.
Yeah. I'm also wondering if there are kind of hybrid solutions, maybe, where you can have sets of worker co-ops that also have some kind of board representation on them from a community group or even a government group that can act as a coordinating body.
Absolutely.
Eroski, right? And as
Mm-hmm.
part of Mondragon is a worker consumer cooperative.
Interesting. I think there's a really great follow-up question that just came in from YouTube, so I'm going to read it. Is the audience member is asking how they're interested in hearing how some of these existing companies might be seeking not only to establish monopolies, but monopolies, right, with excessive buying power for labor and goods. And the example this viewer is telling us is, for example, Deliveroo versus drivers and restaurants, right? And the question they're asking is whether you see a space for a coalition not only between workers organizing, but workers and supply chain members organizing together to create some kind of alternative systems or some kind of countervailing power, right, to these large companies.
Yeah, it's a great question. And in fact, my new research, we started doing the delivery workers and realized maybe we should also add the restaurant owners, because it's exactly, they're both facing the platform, and by organizing together, they might get a much better outcome. So absolutely.
So there's this, in New York City, this has been a problem for such a long time, right? And a city council member, Brad Lander, always said, asked me if, can platform co-ops help, right? And I said, well, they would have to organize, right, the restaurant owners. And now this has actually happened in Quebec with the platform co-op Radish, which does exactly that, right? So they basically create a multi-stakeholder cooperative of couriers, of cooks, and of foodies, right, of the actual customers. And that made just so much sense, right? I mean, it's to basically bring all the people in the ecosystem together as they are all affected, right? Exactly as Juliet said. Yeah.
So I'm going to shift to a slightly different topic. I'm getting questions coming in before actually probably coming back to the same topic again. But I think this one that you directly speak about in your book that we haven't really talked about yet. So this is a good question. The viewer is asking about how, we can speak to how trust is managed on these services and how trustworthiness is measured, displayed, and commodified by both the platforms, the users, and the workers as a kind of monitoring mechanism. And you definitely had a lot to say about that, so we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, it's a really complicated question. So I would say what's interesting to me, the official story is that trust is created through the ratings and reputation systems, which are crowdsourced from the consumer side pretty much everywhere. And so consumers rating the providers, and on many platforms also bilateral. So the providers get to rate the consumers, although there are platforms where that's not the case, and those tend to be sort of less favorable for the providers. Now, in the early days, actually, many people, I think, thought that the rating systems were providing some trust, but in fact, that's probably not why the platforms were working. The main reason they were working was that there were small numbers of bad actors on them. So the initial people who went on them were, well-intentioned and weren't trying to scam and so forth. And we see, like with Craigslist and parts of Craigslist, where if you have an open access platform without any reputational information, it can get overrun with scams. And it's interesting on Craigslist, parts of it are scammy and other parts of it aren't. So that the ratings and reputation systems aren't typically very robust, because people tend to give inflated ratings, and there's a lot of reticence about giving true information. And now there's, a fair amount of literature about this, about how people don't like to give bad ratings, or they're worried that they'll get a bad rating and so forth. So they're not that robust. They're sort of still working because there's not, the number of bad actors on the platforms isn't that large. And in the cases where there have been more issues, the platforms have, partly because of regulation or consumer pressure, they've started to use other external mechanisms for vetting providers. So, for example, criminal records and so forth. Looking across a wide range of literature on these transactions platforms, I would say that solutions to the problem of trust really vary. And so you have some where they do a lot around insurance and rules and so forth. So some of the transportation platforms like car renting and car sharing use that. Couchsurfing is a fascinating one. There's Couchsurfing sort of morphed into kind of a hookup platform to some extent. And one of the things that researchers have found is that the more reputational data that was provided, the less people made really trusting relations. They liked the idea of strangers showing up who they didn't have information about. So, I mean, it's fascinating how much variety there is out there, and it is somewhat platform specific what the best way to create trust is. BlaBlaCar, which is a well-known long distance true ride sharing with very little financial dimension to it in Europe. There, it's kind of, you're supposed to be open to a relationship. You're supposed to talk to the person, and if you're not, when you do a BlaBlaCar, you're not that welcome, because that's the culture of that particular app, is that you talk and become friendly on the ride. So, and then, at the other extreme, Uber put in something which is its mute button, so the rider could just, they say the shut up and drive, like, I don't want to talk to you, kind of, a trust reducing mechanism. So yeah, there's a big literature now in sociology and some adjacent fields around how to create trust on the platform. I would say, a part of the bottom line on this is the big claims that the companies made in the early days that we were all going to become close friends by connecting on these platforms, of course, hasn't happened. And as they have kind of conventionalized, we've gotten, much less interactive kinds of relationships for many of these services.
I can add a sentence about cooperatives, which is there's a fear that with international platform co-ops, distributed ones like Stocksy, that Stocksy is actually not a great example, but with other distributed platform cooperatives, that the essential element of worker cooperatives, which is really this face-to-face and trust, right, gets lost. And we actually find this to be less the case. The much better example is Co-op Cycle, which functions as a federation with a shared digital infrastructure, where the all up and go, right, which is now also expanding to Philadelphia and planning to go global. And so what remains is essentially the small worker cooperative as part of a large federation, all using one digital infrastructure, right? So the trust remains intact. Their everyday remains the same. It's just that they are functioning through this platform. The labor comes, the orders come through this platform.
Yeah, I mean, with our Stocksy study, we found that somewhere, so it was about 1,000 members when we studied it. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 300 were active on their forum, which is the place where all the governance and the connection happens. And it's not just governance decisions, but it's also people helping each other with advice and dealing with problems that's connected with the work. And those people were pretty satisfied with the levels of connection. And the co-op also had money for people to meet up in person. And you could, small pots of money, but that you could, if people were traveling, they could meet other Stocksy members in other countries.
So there's a question now from YouTube, which I think is incredibly ironic given the question. Before the sharing economy, there was a previous moment where the internet was kind of, as they put it, hijacked by 5 to 6 mega corporations. And apparently Google is already entering the gig economy on its own, right? As a self-standing company. So the person who asked this question asks us, can we solve the problems of the sharing economy and the gig economy without first solving the problem of the privatization of the internet and creating new kinds of structures for governing the internet, or maybe even the digital economy, as I would put it? Like Trebor is clapping, I like that.
Do you want to start with this one, Trebor?
I'm excited.
Well, I think this is important, and maybe a little corrective to or maybe a little addition to what you wrote about platform co-ops in the book, because it's really, I see this as a split screen, right? And I completely agree with the premise of the question, because you can't build democracy, on something that is so undemocratic, right? As many, I don't know, I was listening to a labor podcast yesterday, and they were pointing out that it was hosted by AWS, right? And so are many platform co-ops, right? So of course, right, you need to think about labor, but you also need to think about digital infrastructure, right? And within the sort of digital cooperative economy, there are so many dedicated to exactly that, right? So this is really half of this movement is dedicated to building digital infrastructure, to building, now there's an enormous, especially from also very much great interest from legal scholars and from scientists like Alex Pentland and others in data cooperatives, right? And thinking about cooperatives as a structure that can help to organize data, that can create, a cooperative cloud and create maybe data trusts that are, which have a stewardship that is, provided by cooperatives. So I think it's a great question, just sort of pointing in that direction, because that's really the other universe that is also part of our work.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I guess what I would say, though, is that so that's also a fight we have to have, but it doesn't mean we can't try and build our alternatives and build power in these in this sector that we're talking about, while we have to rely on these, the problematic current structure. And the people who are fighting those battles are our allies. And as each of our movements gets stronger, we support the other. One really interesting thing that we're seeing, and we're studying it in my current research project, is the movement away from care.com, which is the Uber of the caring labor sector. I mean, there's been so much work on Uber and so little on care.com, but it's a huge platform that is, where people go to get babysitting and elder care and more than that now. But so what we've seen is that many people have, instead of using care.com, they're on Facebook. They've created their own Facebook groups, which operate kind of cooperatively, which have providers and consumers, so parents and babysitters, for example. They're moderated. There's no, the groups themselves don't take money or anything, and they create their own rules and so forth. So it's a kind of spontaneous alternative to the for-profit corporate version, offering. And these may be, that in Austin, when Uber and Lyft left, they developed something kind of similar for rides, for taxis. So it's interesting. Facebook, it's such a problematic platform in so many ways, but it's also a place where people are creating these much more informal, but, really significant alternatives to for-profit provisioning.
What I can add here is that, we also floated a proposal to convert care.com into a platform co-op. And because it was up for acquisition, right, it was actually not even that expensive, for a foundation, for example, to jump in. But it didn't succeed. But I think to think about also the prospect or the possibility of conversion of these platforms is a really realistic one, and also one that we should pursue.
Can I step in with my own question for Trebor? And it's, early on when I started doing this research, one of the sort of alternatives that there was a little bit of talk about was public ownership, so municipal ownership of platforms. And there was one attempt to do this in the UK, which failed pretty miserably, pretty quickly, as I'm sure you know. And I didn't hear much about it. I would say in the last month or two, I'm starting to hear a lot more about it. And I even learned about the city of Long Beach, which has one for emergency child care, publicly owned platform. I'm curious about your thoughts, since you've worked much more, outside of that context. I'm curious about your thoughts about municipally owned platforms and what you think of that in relationship, say, to the more canonical platform co-ops.
Yeah, I agree completely with your initial point about this. This kind of patchwork of different models, and the problem with the circular firing squads of progressives, right, which always favor one model over the other and attack each other, which I think is very wrong. So I'm very much in support of public ownership, and like you, I see a lot of initiatives jumping up in San Diego, for example. Is one. And then, of course, all over France, you have this interesting mixture of the work that is done by Mobi Co-op, right, which is providing last mile solutions for cooperative in some case cooperative, in some case not cooperative, last mile solutions for public transportation. So the train arriving in rural France is then picked up by, there's a direct connection from the public transportation network to the platform co-op or to the whatever LLC or whatever else there is, right? So I'm entirely in support of that, of course. You saw this, of course, in Seoul, right, in Korea, where this was very much run like that, right? A municipally owned taxi services.
This is actually an opportunity I'm going to take to plug some work Berggrun's going to be putting out in a couple of weeks. A report I worked on essentially what we call the real data dividend, which we are planning to introduce certain taxation and what we call digital industrial policy steps to have public management of the kind of useful data that might be usable to build an alternative platform towards the Googles and the Facebooks that can be used and integrated with cooperatives. And in fact, we have special carve-outs for, first of all, data consumer cooperatives that might want to interact with these platforms. And also special, we have actually mentioned that maybe platform co-ops can have special non-rate access to the kind of public data infrastructure we're proposing, right? And I think this is really, we're already seeing some experimentation with this in localities like Barcelona, and I think it could be quite expanded with both tax and direct incentives for firms to share their useful marketable data within with a public database, essentially. I think that's and that's how we've dealt with other utility issues, especially in the United States. And I think that's how we can deal with it with these new platforms, which are looking more and more like utilities, at least to me.
And that's where I feel it's so important, right, that all these legal scholars and economists actually sit at one table with real co-op historians and co-op experts, right, who have studied cooperatives, who know what happens when you start a consumer cooperative, and who really understand these issues. I see so many legal scholars approaching me, like to, speak on panels about, data trusts or data cooperatives. And, legal academia isn't exactly known for knowing much about cooperatives, right? So I think to bring this expertise together is really crucial at this exact moment, right? So that legal scholars actually really have a deep understanding of, what were the outcomes of particular forms, right? What really helps towards social justice, Is the consumer co-op model or the purchasing cooperative, is that, ideally suited, or are there other forms? Is it a multi-stakeholder? These kinds of questions.
I think this is I think actually we have only a few minutes left, so I think this is a good way to wind down. Maybe before I go, I just want to let you know there is apparently a really intense debate happening right now within our questions and answer platform, trying to understand whether some of the more commercial entities, Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash, should be even understood as close to being in the sharing economy, or whether these are just labor market intermediaries, and whether there's going to be whether they will succeed in trying to monopolize labor, or even if it's possible. So maybe those concluding thoughts, and I think we should try to start winding down as we're getting closer and closer to a consensus here.
Can I add on with a request for the ending? Which would be just the plea to maybe think about, Juliet, because I know there are so many practitioners and they sort of read your book and they really want to know, Juliet Schor, what should I do in the next 3 years with my life? So this will be your advice column here.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, the term sharing economy has really gone out of favor because it's, it's very hard to see anything like sharing in ride hail or in food delivery or in some of these commercial services. And even with Airbnb, where home sharing, it was, you could call it that when somebody hosted someone else in their home. When someone's just renting out a whole apartment, the sharing isn't really there. So I think that's the easier part of that question. And by the way, Uber always rejected the idea that it was part of the sharing economy. It's the one platform that never wanted to be part of it. Unlike Lyft, unlike Airbnb, those companies welcomed that sharing discourse and used it themselves, and so forth. So Uber is interesting because it really has, with the levels of control that it exerts over the workers, it really has morphed much more into what looks like a conventional employer than a true peer-to-peer marketplace or a true peer-to-peer platform. And of course, Lyft basically being the same model. Some of the other platforms still allow more flexibility, autonomy, et cetera, from the earners on them. And so they're different. And the food delivery are kind of following in the ride hail. They're operating a lot like the ride hail. So, sharing economy, if I use it now, I would tend to put quotes around it. We use the term platform economy a lot more as we talk about this. To Trebor's question, if you are a practitioner or a gig worker, what do the next 3 years hold, or what advice? I guess I would say I think that unless you're someone who already has a fairly unique marketable skill, so you're a designer on Upwork with a really great reputation, and you can get a lot of good gigs and you're making a fair amount of money, or you're on another platform that's really working for you, maybe Airbnb, for example. I think that two things. One is the more dependent you are on the platform, the worse your outcomes are going to be. I mean, that was a big finding of our book. So if you can find other sources of income so that you can exercise more control in your relationship to the platform, you will be much better off. And the second thing is, as Trebor mentioned, the last year especially has been remarkable for the level of organizing that gig workers have been involved in. And although they haven't, necessarily had the giant win yet, like a whole platform getting unionized, or there are some major victories. And so I think that, in contrast to what many scholars thought at the beginning, that it would be impossible to organize these workers because they're geographically dispersed, we see that's not the case. There's really great organizing going on among gig workers. I would say that that's the thing that is going in the long run to really make a difference, whether it's organizing on a corporate platform to get change there, or organizing to create an alternative platform, or joining one that others are doing. And one nice thing about the platform world is that you can join a cooperative, and if it doesn't have a lot of business, you can also stay on the corporate platform at the same time, which is not the case in a lot of jobs. So I guess organize. That's a pretty obvious thing to say, but in the end, I think there's probably no bigger truth than that about how workers can, improve their lives in capitalist economies.
I think with that, we are coming towards the end of our time. I would really love to thank Professor Schor for taking the time this morning, this afternoon, or whatever time zone we were all in, to have this conversation. It's really wonderful and enlightening. And I'd like to thank Trebor for co-hosting this and being such a great interlocutor. Trebor, any final words before we sign off?
Oh, no, just a big hug to everybody. And thank you to Juliet Schor. Yeah, really amazing and insightful. And I loved these recommendations at the end. We saw often people organizing, and if that didn't work, they put on strikes, and if that didn't work, they started a platform co-op. But now we just learned, why not do both at the same time?
Yeah. Thanks to you. Thanks to the audience for the great questions. I I'm really looking forward to going to the YouTube channel and seeing that raging debate. And it's a pleasure. This is such a great community of people. And I look forward to continuing to work with many of you on these issues. And it's been really a privilege.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.